She just wanted to buy ingredients for a cake. A 15-year-old girl, alone, quiet, kind. But when three arrogant thugs cornered her in a supermarket and began mocking her, no one helped. Not one person stepped in. What they didn't know is that she had an uncle, and he had just walked through those automatic doors. His name was Jason Statham. And what happened next would change everyone in that store. Forever. The automatic doors of the small neighborhood supermarket parted with a tired sigh as a young girl stepped through, clutching a folded sheet of paper in her hand. Her name was Emily, 15 years old, slim-framed, shoulders hunched slightly, wearing a denim jacket 2 sizes too big and sneakers whose laces dragged along the tiled floor. The list in her hand trembled a little, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of responsibility she placed upon herself. Today was important. She had planned it quietly, away from her mother's distracted gaze, away from the loudness of the world. She had saved a few bills she'd earned babysitting a neighbor's dog and intended to buy the ingredients for a cake. A special cake. One she had learned from an old recipe card her uncle had written for her years ago. The same uncle who had been gone for a long time. Jason Statham wasn't just a famous face on movie posters to her. He was the man who used to braid her hair with shaky fingers, who built her a bicycle ramp and cheered louder than anyone when she managed to land it without falling. He had always been her protector, her safe place. And today, he was coming home. As Emily moved through the aisles, she counted aloud in her head: eggs, butter, sugar, cocoa powder. Her fingers danced along the products with care, placing each item in her small shopping basket as though handling fragile glass. Her face was soft, serene, with a hint of a nervous smile stretching beneath her quiet eyes. Her earbuds hummed gently with a melody Jason had once shared with her, a soundtrack from a film where the hero didn't win by fighting, but by standing his ground. But the soft rhythm of that world was about to be shattered. The bell above the door rang again. It wasn't loud, but the presence that entered was. 3 boys, probably around 18, entered laughing loudly, slapping each other's backs. Their energy was a sharp contrast to the quiet calm of the store. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a smirk that never left his face, led the trio. The others followed like shadows trying to outgrow themselves. They walked in wide strides, knocking a snack display slightly off balance, tossing a bag of chips at each other, shouting over one another like the place belonged to them. Their presence sucked the air out of the room. Emily turned a corner and immediately slowed her pace. She felt them before she saw them. Her shoulders tensed. She reached for the flour on the top shelf and accidentally dropped a bag of sugar. It burst near her feet, scattering a fine white powder across the tile like a broken promise. The laughter came quickly. Too quickly. They saw her. All of them. And they didn't look away. The leader nudged one of the boys and nodded toward Emily. She didn't hear what he said, but the tone was unmistakable. Cruel amusement. He moved first, sauntering toward her, pretending to examine a box of cereal next to her. His movements were exaggerated, performative, like he wanted an audience. Emily didn't look up. Her hands moved faster, placing the items in her basket, but her breathing had changed, shallower, uneven. As she turned to walk away, one of them accidentally bumped her basket. It fell, contents scattering again. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She bent down to collect the items. A foot stepped forward and crushed one of the eggs against the floor. She froze. The boy laughed and clapped his hands. One of the others made a sarcastic comment. Another mimicked her, crouching with exaggerated slowness. Around them, shoppers kept moving. One woman glanced over but looked away just as quickly. The cashier frowned but said nothing. The store security, leaning near the exit, adjusted his belt and remained still. Emily stood up slowly. Her face was flushed now, the blush climbing from her neck to her ears. Her hand trembled as she held the cracked egg carton against her chest. And still, no one said a word. She walked toward the checkout. The leader followed. The other two lingered by the refrigerated section, pretending to be amused by the contents of the freezer. At the register, Emily pulled out a worn debit card. Her fingers fumbled over the keypad. Before she could enter anything, the boy leaned over and snatched the card from her hand. He tilted his head, inspecting it mockingly, then raised it high above his head like a trophy. Emily stared up at him, silent. Her eyes shimmered. Not tears, yet, but the heaviness behind them spoke louder than any scream. The cashier began to speak, but hesitated as the boy threw him a glance that dared him to interfere. And then, the store changed. Not in sound, because the noise still filled the air. Not in light, because the flickering fluorescent bulb still buzzed above, but in presence. Near aisle 7, by the gondola of canned goods, a man stood perfectly still. He had entered the store without drawing attention. No entourage, no fanfare. Just a worn black hoodie, dark jeans, and a quiet expression carved from years of experience. Jason Statham had returned home, not to be recognized, not to be celebrated, but at that exact moment, to witness. He stood with his arms crossed, a can of beans in one hand, his gaze locked on the scene at the checkout. His jaw was set, but his eyes were calm, too calm. His presence wasn't loud, it was surgical. The leader still had the card in hand, but his smirk was beginning to waver. Something had shifted. A few shoppers noticed Jason, not for who he was, but for what he radiated. A quiet power that didn't demand space, it commanded it. Emily hadn't seen him yet. Her head was down, fingers clenched around the edge of the counter, her breath shallow and scattered. But Jason's eyes never left her. He took a step forward. The sound was nothing more than the soft creak of a worn sneaker against linoleum. But it was enough. The boy holding the card froze. The other two turned toward the sound. Jason stood taller now. He wasn't posing. He wasn't threatening. He simply existed, and that was enough to bring everything else to a halt. The store fell into a hush, a silence not of reverence but of reckoning. Something was about to shift, not through violence, not through a heroic charge, but through presence. Because Emily, that sweet girl clutching a cake mix and a memory, was not alone. And Jason had never been a man who tolerated cruelty when it stood face to face with innocence. And as the boy slowly lowered the card, as if gravity had found him again, Jason took another step. No words, no fury, just quiet certainty. The kind of certainty that makes cowards question their strength. And what those three boys didn't know was that the girl they mocked had been raised with more strength in her silence than they'd ever known in their noise. And the man now walking toward them wasn't just her uncle. He was a storm wrapped in restraint. And he had just arrived. Jason Statham stood between aisles lined with canned soup and instant noodles, but he might as well have been standing on the edge of a battlefield. His posture didn't change, yet everything around him did. The air stiffened. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed colder, harsher, as if reality itself was narrowing into a singular point of focus. Him. He didn't rush. His steps were deliberate, quiet, like someone counting seconds before a storm breaks. Each movement was subtle but undeniable, an exhale that said more than a scream, a glance that carried the weight of decisions already made. The three boys felt it before they saw it. The leader, still holding Emily's card between two fingers, glanced toward the approaching man. He didn't recognize him, not fully, not yet, but his instincts reacted before his mind did. Something about the way the man moved, measured, grounded, utterly unshaken, stirred discomfort beneath the surface of his bravado. Jason stopped 2 steps behind Emily. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder. He didn't whisper reassurance. He simply existed beside her. And in that existence, Emily's breath finally slowed. She didn't have to look back. She felt him like a wall at her back, a lighthouse in a fog she hadn't known how to escape. The leader laughed nervously, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying him. One of his friends murmured something and inched to the side, suddenly aware of how visible they were. Jason's eyes didn't blink. He tilted his head just slightly, the way a father might when disappointed, not angry, just aware of everything. Emily turned her head halfway, and when she saw him, her eyes widened. Not in fear, not in surprise, but in release. The weight that had gripped her chest for the past 10 minutes cracked and fell away. Jason remained silent. The boy still holding the card now looked like he wanted to place it back in Emily's hand but couldn't quite move. The attention in the room had shifted entirely. Shoppers pretended to browse shelves, but their eyes flickered toward the confrontation. The security guard at the front door straightened his stance but didn't move forward. His face was pale. He knew now who this man was, not from the movies, from the energy alone. Jason's gaze slid to the crushed eggs on the floor. The cracked shell mirrored something deeper, a metaphor made real in the mess these boys had left behind. He stepped forward, and the boy flinched. Not from a raised hand. None had moved. But from something far more threatening. Consequence. Jason slowly lowered his gaze and pointed with just a shift of his chin toward the basket on the floor. The boy looked down, then hesitated. The second boy nudged him from behind, whispering sharp and urgent words. With shaking fingers, the leader placed the card back on the counter and began picking up the groceries. Jason didn't thank him. He didn't nod. His face remained unreadable, stone carved by years of restraint and clarity. Once the basket was repacked, Jason stepped beside Emily and gently took hold of the handle. Still without a word, he walked her to the exit. The boy stepped back, as if unsure whether to speak again. But he didn't. He couldn't. Jason and Emily walked in silence past the checkout, past the shoppers now pretending not to stare. Her head was still low, but her steps no longer wavered. The door opened for them with the same mechanical sigh. Sunlight spilled across the pavement. Outside, the world continued. Cars drove by, birds sang, wind tugged softly at tree branches. But Emily's world had shifted. At the edge of the parking lot, Jason stopped. He didn't look back. But he stood still, the basket still in his hand. Emily stood beside him, fingers clenched, breathing measured. She looked up at him, but he didn't move. In her heart, she knew he was holding something back. Something boiling low, not rage, but memory. The kind of memory that could drive a man not toward revenge, but toward truth. She remembered the time Jason had walked into her school after someone carved a slur into her locker. He hadn't raised his voice then either. He had walked down the hallway like a shadow among whispers. And by the end of that day, there had been silence. Not from fear, but from understanding. Jason was never loud. He didn't need to be. But even as they stood outside, the tension behind him lingered. The boys were still inside. The scene was not finished. The lesson had not yet taken form. Emily's hand gently touched his arm. It wasn't to hold him back. It was to remind him she was okay, or trying to be. Jason finally turned. Not fully. Just enough to glance through the glass of the sliding doors. Inside, the boys remained frozen in place, like statues left behind by a storm that refused to pass. Jason's gaze lingered for another heartbeat. Then he turned back to Emily and nodded once. The kind of nod that said, "You're safe now." The kind of nod that said, "But not finished." He walked her to the car, but his steps weren't heavy with finality. They were measured, calculated. He wasn't done. Because Jason had left many things behind in his life, sets, cities, scripts. But what he could never walk away from was injustice seen with his own eyes. And as the engine of the car hummed to life and Emily whispered a quiet thank you into the silence between them, Jason's eyes didn't reflect peace. They reflected a promise, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken, the kind that by morning would echo through an entire neighborhood. The sun had already begun its descent behind the rooftops when Jason returned. He walked alone. No car, no noise. Just footsteps echoing softly against the cracked sidewalk of a neighborhood that hadn't changed much since his youth. Except now, the people looked away quicker, and the silence between neighbors lasted longer. Jason wore the same black hoodie. His posture hadn't shifted. Calm, centered. But beneath the stillness, something burned, slow and deep, like coals waiting for the right breath of air. The supermarket stood in the distance, small and unassuming, its lights still humming in the windows. He didn't walk toward it, not yet. Instead, he stopped across the street where the shadows stretched longer than usual. A group of teenagers lingered near a bench outside the adjacent plaza, laughing loudly, passing around their own self-importance like a secret handshake. Among them, the three from earlier. They hadn't left. The leader stood tall, arms folded, recounting something with exaggerated gestures. The two others laughed on cue, even if the story had holes. Their laughs were louder now, trying to patch over the memory of what had happened inside. One of them noticed Jason. The boy's expression faltered mid-sentence. His hand slowly dropped to his side. Jason didn't move. He just stood there, on the edge of the sidewalk, lit by the last rays of golden sun like a statue placed too perfectly to be real. Inside the supermarket, the manager watched from behind tinted glass. His hands were folded, but not confidently. There was tension in his knuckles. He hadn't said anything earlier, and now his silence weighed more than the moment itself. Jason crossed the street. Every step was unhurried. Every second felt stretched. Even the breeze paused. He walked past the automatic doors, which opened again with that familiar tired sigh. The same shelves, the same dull lights, but a different presence now filled the space. The same security guard glanced over but quickly busied himself near the gum rack. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, straightened her back as if something sacred had entered. Jason stopped near the checkout aisle, not where Emily had stood, but a few steps behind. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. His stillness did all the speaking. From a side door near the storeroom, the manager emerged. His name tag crooked, shirt slightly wrinkled. He walked slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a mirror he wasn't ready to face. Jason turned his head slightly. Their eyes met. There were no questions asked, no accusations made, just the heavy gravity of two men standing in a moment too honest to avoid. The manager cleared his throat, then lowered his gaze. He said nothing, but his posture shifted, an apology that would never be vocalized but would be felt in every policy change to come. Jason nodded, once. Not in forgiveness. Not yet. Just acknowledgement. He turned and walked back outside. The three boys were still there, but quieter now. The crowd that had once encircled them had thinned. The weight of the day hung heavy in the air, even if they tried to brush it off with nervous jokes and glances over their shoulders. Jason walked toward them. He didn't rush. He didn't square his shoulders or widen his steps. He walked the same way a tide moves, inevitable and deep, swallowing hesitation with every inch. The leader straightened his back, crossed his arms, and tried to hold his ground. The others stepped back slightly. No one laughed now. Jason stopped in front of them. There were no fists, no threats, just eyes. His, locked on theirs, like a mirror showing them who they really were when the noise was stripped away. The boy looked away first, then the second. Jason stood for a few more seconds, long enough to let silence finish what confrontation never could. Then he turned. Behind him, the street held its breath. He walked toward the sidewalk again, toward nothing in particular, but each step left behind a change, not in words, in weight. Because Jason's presence didn't teach with noise, it taught with absence. But the lesson wasn't over, because just as Jason disappeared down the block, a familiar figure rounded the corner. A small frame clinging to a paper box. A box tilted slightly, frosting smeared against the lid. Emily. She had finished the cake. She had come back to return something. Not the ingredients, but the belief that kindness was still louder than cruelty, and what she was about to witness would stay with her for the rest of her life. The late afternoon light scattered across the cracked pavement as Emily turned the corner. carefully balancing a plastic cake box in her hands. Her footsteps were unsure, but steady, like someone approaching a memory too big to carry alone. The cake was slightly crooked, the frosting imperfect. The words on top, piped in shaky blue icing, were barely legible. "Welcome home, Uncle Jay." But that didn't matter. She had returned not for applause or validation, but because something in her heart told her the story wasn't finished. She felt it in the silence her uncle had left behind, in the way his eyes had remained focused on something she couldn't name, a lesson unspoken, a reckoning still unfolding. As she neared the plaza, she saw him. Jason was no longer in the center of the street. He stood now near a wall covered in faded graffiti, his back to the boys, his gaze lifted toward nothing in particular. The boys remained behind him, still frozen in a space they couldn't escape. They hadn't run, they hadn't spoken, because something about that silence had shifted them. Jason didn't look at Emily as she approached. He didn't need to. He knew she was there, like he always had, since she was small enough to sit on his shoulders and ask why the world could be so loud and so unfair. Since the day she cried over a broken toy and he sat beside her on the floor for hours, not fixing it but simply letting her feel. She stood beside him now, cake trembling slightly in her grip. Her eyes moved from the boys to the ground, where a crushed soda can lay like a forgotten insult. Jason turned. He didn't speak. He didn't nod, but his hand gently steadied the cake box, just for a second, so Emily could reset her grip. That was enough. A crowd had started to form again. Not out of curiosity this time, but out of respect. Neighbors stood quietly. Store employees lingered in doorways. An older man leaned on his cane, watching like someone who had seen far too much ugliness in his life, and finally glimpsed something right. Jason stepped forward. The boys didn't move. Not this time. He didn't confront them. He didn't make a show. Instead, he stood in front of them and held their gaze, not with anger, but with clarity, as if peeling back every layer they had built to protect themselves from who they really were. And then something strange happened. The leader, tall, once smug, now quiet, lowered his head. Not in defeat, in realization. Jason didn't react. He simply turned away, letting the moment breathe. Emily stood at the center of the plaza now, the cake in her hands, her posture straighter than before. The breeze lifted her hair gently and she looked around, not to see who was watching, but to understand what had changed. And everything had. The manager of the store stepped out slowly and approached a small corkboard near the entrance. In a motion that was almost ceremonial, he removed a faded promotional sign and replaced it with a handwritten notice. A piece of paper, simple, clear. In this place, no one will be humiliated again. No branding, no logos, just truth. Emily's eyes glistened. She hadn't cried earlier, when she was mocked, when she was ignored. But now, in the wake of stillness and dignity, the tears finally came. Jason walked toward her, took the cake from her hands, and carried it carefully as if it were something sacred. He didn't say a word. But as they began to leave, step by step, the crowd shifted, not away, but toward them, not to interrupt, but to witness. Some nodded. Some placed a hand over their chest. No one applauded. Because this wasn't a performance. It was a reminder that strength doesn't roar. It stands. Quiet. Certain. Unshakable. And in that small corner of a city too busy to notice its own shadows, a lesson was planted. Not with fists, not with speeches, but with presence. Because real strength doesn't live in muscles or threats. It lives in men who choose to act when silence becomes unbearable. It lives in girls who return to the scene of their humiliation, holding their head higher than before. And it lives in the moments we carry forever, when someone showed us that we were worth protecting. Jason Statham didn't come to fight, but when it was time to stand, he made sure no one watching would ever forget what respect truly looks like. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is stand, not to fight, not to shout, But to make it clear, there are lines you don't cross. Not when dignity is on the line, not when innocence is under threat, and especially not when Jason Statham is watching. If this story moved you, share it. Let others remember what real strength looks like. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, subscribe now, leave a comment, and never forget, silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's just the calm before the lesson that changes everything.